That's day one of a series on understanding and managing invasive plant species in Botswana ecosystem. Invasive plant species are not just a scientific issue, they are real and growing challenges affecting ecosystem and biodiversity. But today we're going to be focusing on Botswana as a case study that you're going to be learning from. Yes, so like we mentioned, we have two amazing speakers in the room, Diana Rodrigo and Dr. Grant Martin. Today's session is going to focus on the foundation of invasion biology, which is going to also to help us not only understand the science behind of invasive plant species, but also the human dimension and interaction that influences how these species get to spread and how they can be managed. So our first speaker is going to be Dr. Martin, and Dr. Martin, his work has been focusing on developing and evaluating biological control solution for invasive plant species, particularly in grassland and mountain ecosystem. And what makes his work mainly, especially and more impactful, is his focus on restoring native ecosystem while reducing negative effects of invasive plant species. And that is something that is relevant to the challenges that we are going to be discussing. And our second speaker is Diana Rodrigo. Diana Rodrigo brings a unique and important perspective to this conversation. Diana believes that people are part of biodiversity, and conservation is not just about ecosystem, but also about how humans interact with nature and the environment. And her perspective, I would say, will help us to understand the human dimension of biology invasion and why collaboration across different fields is so important. And without further ado, and without taking much of your time, let's get started. Dr. Grant, the floor is yours. And I will ask the speakers to again do their introduction, because I only gave a brief short description about what they're doing. But Grant, you're welcome. The floor is yours.
So I'm just going to start quickly. My name's Grant Martin, and thanks, Diane, for that introduction. I'm one of the Deputy Directors from the Centre for Biocontrol and Associate Professor at Rhodes University. In South Africa, biocontrol is a very important component of our weed management practice. And in South Africa, we really struggle with a lot of invasive species, and we utilize biocontrol as one of the key contributors to our management, and is regarded as one of the fundamentals to getting success, to getting reduction of weed populations. And the Centre for Biocontrol is the biggest non-government organization conducting biocontrol research as well as application of the process in South Africa. It's based at Rhodes University, but we have a consortium of universities and research entities underneath us. And alongside with that, we have MOUs signed with a number of scientific and research entities throughout Africa, as well as around the globe, including Europe, the USA, New Zealand, Australia. So it really has a wide-reaching sort of attraction for biocontrol. And the aim of the Centre for Biocontrol really is just to reduce the amount of pesticides we introduce into the environment, to try and look for green solutions to reduce the harmful impacts of pests. And we have two main arms. We have an agricultural side where we try and reduce the pesticide use for managing insect pests on agricultural crops. And then the side I'm more heavily involved in is looking for biological control options for invasive plant species, weeds. And that gets me into the talk I'm going to give today, which is on invasion biology with a focus on invasive plants and biological control. It wasn't mentioned in the beginning there. I'm doing a little stand-in job for Dr. Kim Canavan, who unfortunately has a few personal issues she's sorting out today, so I'm filling in for her. So any questions can in the future be directed to her. No, that's a joke. I'm happy I'll be here all afternoon to address any questions. Okay, so it was nice to see those questions coming up beforehand. Some of those things we're going to touch on again. And it was really nice to see this really strong response and everyone getting it right. So firstly, what is an exotic species? In absolute basic form, it's a species that's not supposed to be where it is. So if the main contingent here is from Botswana, it's any species not from Botswana. It's something that's introduced, and usually that's introduced into that region through human-mediated activities. I think I was the only one who got that question wrong in the quiz. I suggested it was human-mediated, but there were also other factors. So it can be described in basic as a process that transports and introduces species outside of their natural range, intentionally or unintentionally by human activities, to a region where it may become established and spread. And there's a really nice little diagram that I've just put in here, and this goes through the phases of a biological invasion, and it's available in this IPBES document that came out in 2023. Anyone involved in invasion biology should be looking at that document. It's an incredible document, a great synthesis of all the global data. It breaks it down into continents and countries, but really a nice document that works on invasive species. And you can get a lot of really good information there. So I've just put that up. I'll go through some of it quickly, just to cover the basics. So a native species is a species that is found in its natural range. So species from Botswana that are meant to be there, that have always evolved there, would be regarded as a native species. But the first step of a biological invasion is transport. So that's a human activity of picking that species up and moving it out of Botswana into a new region, or from another region into Botswana. And those can be either intentionally, somebody intentionally wants to move it, or it can be unintentionally, and that we'd call that a hitchhiker. A really easy example of that is you visit South Africa, you walk around in our grassland biome, and you pick up a whole lot of these really spiky little grass seeds. You return to Botswana, those seeds were hidden on your in your socks. You didn't know they were there. You get home, you pull them out of your socks, and you release them into the environment, and that would be a hitchhiker. Once they're then out of their native range, they become an alien species. So this is a species that's no longer native, but it's like those grass seeds. It has to establish and start growing. If it just perishes, then that's the end of the line. But if it starts producing self-sustaining population, it's an established alien species. Again, as mentioned in the quiz, it's very important to realize that not all exotic species are harmful. We have moved things around the world for hundreds of years for their beneficial attributes. Some species can also be beneficial and have negative attributes, but we know so many species that are alien, which are not from there. And these are crop species. A lot of our livestock animals, cats, dogs, bees are introduced. So not all exotic or alien species are harmful. However, if a species is introduced into the environment and it becomes a problem, as in it starts causing either environmental or economic impacts, we usually start to label those. There are various definitions, but we call it an invasive alien species, a species that's having an impact where it has established. And after that, once it's established and having an impact, and we'll get into it a bit later, you can look at the area of distribution it can start having that impact in. So just to go back to pathways, effectively there are two main pathways. This was made by Kim's sister. And it's a really nice diagram to show, and I'll come back to this using a nice example about an invasive weed in Botswana a bit later. But you have a source population, usually in another continent. I also use the example where it doesn't have to be in a different continent. And the primary pathway is crossing out of a biogeographical jurisdictional boundary. The common way that is occurring is through ships or planes, and then introduced into a new environment. And once in that new environment, it can then spread widely within that environment to anywhere it can effectively grow, if we talk about plants. And this is then where a number of those other vectors we're talking about, the secondary pathways, which then include animals, humans, wind, water, and it can spread throughout the environment. I mentioned movement with planes and ships, and that's sort of regarded as globalization. This massive increase of it over the years. And this little schematic shows what is in 2013, so quite a long time ago, but just how interconnected the world now is, allowing opportunities for organisms, intentionally and unintentionally again, to spread absolutely everywhere in the globe, and just about nowhere is safe anymore from the threat of organisms getting into those ecosystems. This graph, this data still comes from that IPBES report, but it's to show that everything basically can become an invasive species. All taxa, mammals, birds, fish, insects, crustaceans, mollusks, algae, and fungi, all can be potentially an invasive species. And then these little graphs where each of those taxa are highlighted also just shows you the increase. Those are the number of each one of those recorded around the world, and you can see this huge increase as we're getting closer to 2020 and the number being introduced into the various ecosystems around the world. I'm just going to give you two quick examples, some real highlights of them. There's absolutely thousands of invasive species, but some are more iconic and charismatic than others. And nothing says more iconic or charismatic than an absolutely monstrous snake. So these are Burmese pythons. They were introduced into Florida, introduced through quite a common mode of introduction, and that's the pet trade. So people wanted Burmese pythons as pets in their houses. I'm not sure why anyone would do that, but it's quite common. And so they were imported to the USA. Some were being housed in facilities, and then they were released into the environment. There's a bit of back and forth on the exact method, but the point is they got out into the environment. These are from Southeast Asia, so they're not meant to be in Florida. And in Florida, they found a habitat that absolutely they adore. And what they're doing is these are indiscriminate feeders. They will eat absolutely anything. There are records of them eating up to 2 meter long alligators. So if you could imagine a 2 meter crocodile, these snakes are capable of eating one that size. But they'll eat birds and mammals. And that's really is having an ecosystem level impact in Florida, pushing a lot of species out of the ecosystems because of the damage they're doing. They're becoming so abundant that there's about 2 per hectare in Florida. So if you can imagine every football field, there's about 2 of these snakes. You could potentially find one there. So really, really noticeable impact of a big invasive species. And then everyone in Africa should know about this, but if you don't, it's now perch. So the previous example is introduction across continents. This is an example of an introduction within a continent. The lake in the background there is Lake Victoria, and these perch were introduced from the Nile into Lake Victoria in about 1950s to try and start a fishery for these large perch. Unfortunately, these perch, again, are indiscriminate feeders. They'll eat absolutely anything. And very quickly, they pushed hundreds of local native small fish to extinction. It's estimated they've caused the extinction of over 200 species of cichlid. In doing so, they sort of collapsed the rural fisheries that relied on the cichlids. Some people definitely benefited from being able to harvest these huge fish and sell the fillets, as well as the gallbladders, but a lot of people were really impacted by the reduction of the native fisheries that existed. A second kick-on from this is while the native cichlids can be sun-dried, if you want to dry these large oily fish, you need to smoke them. And so smoking these new fish that are in the environment caused quite a lot of deforestation around the lake as well. The reduction of smaller fish in the lake allowed for more algal blooms and the spread of some diseases like bilharzia. So again, another example of the introduction of invasive species having a significant impact on the ecosystem, but also the people living within those systems. As I also said, though, that everything can be invasive species, and plants are generally regarded of the worst of the invasive species. The IUCN has a list of the top 100 invasive species, and the vast majority of those species are vascular plants. So plants are really where I make my daily bread. It's what I study, but they are very, very problematic and can have significant impacts around the globe. Quick example from the US, and another poster child for invasive species is kudzu vine, the vine that ate the South. It was introduced from Japan into the USA about 1870s. This is a vine with an extremely large taproot, which isn't that common for vines, but it has a very large taproot that allows it to survive drought, as well as if fires go through, it seems to survive after that. And it spreads incredibly quickly. It can grow up to 30 centimeters a day. And it causes these sort of green oceans where nothing else exists in this, because it will kill all other plant species, or climb up trees and collapse trees and any other plants growing in that environment, or completely wipe them out, just outcompeting them. It has one very unique impact for plants. It's during photosynthesis, it emits isoprene and nitric oxide. So it's one of the few plants that sort of contributes to air pollution. And so people living near huge invasions can actually have impacts of poor air quality on them. And the joke in the South is of the USA is you close your windows at night to stop the vines growing in and attaching to your feet. The next example is one that I think will be appropriate to everyone in the room, and also nicely shows the movement of invasive species, those primary and secondary modes of transportation or movement. And that's Lantana camara. It's very prevalent in Botswana, South Africa, and most of Africa. And it comes from Central America, where it was introduced quite early on into Kew Gardens. It wasn't the first place it got introduced to, but it was taken early across the ocean and introduced into Kew Gardens in Europe. Because of its pretty flowers, it was extensively grown in Kew Gardens in greenhouses. People were trying to grow nicer colors and varieties of colors, but they were also growing them in extreme environmental conditions to try and make them hardier, to allow people to grow them easily in their own gardens. And if you follow those lines, you can see the one line in 1858 leaving Kew Gardens and heading down to South Africa. And that was no longer really the species that left South America. It was sort of a human modified, was an invasive species there, but flower variety leaving Kew Gardens and introduced into South Africa. It was also incredibly tough, as in it had been hardened in the laboratory. From there, it got exported to Australia and New Zealand and India and Southeast Asia, and effectively around the world, where it has spread and caused significant damage wherever it has established. So what it does is effectively it causes reduction in the grazing capacity of areas and causes photosensitization in any livestock. There's a bit of a horrible picture there, but if you want some really horrible pictures, you can go onto the internet and just see what it can do to livestock that are having to graze amongst lantana. It forms dense monocultures, outcompeting native vegetation. It's also allelopathic, so it adds chemicals into the ground that affects the quality of the fodder. And so if you're getting this into a rangeland environment or anywhere you're trying to keep livestock, you can get up to a 90% reduction in the amount of livestock you can sort of keep in that environment. And that's seen in most places wherever lantana has established and spread. And so lantana is really a tough weed to manage because it grows in these huge variation of climatic conditions. Also because we specifically bred it to be a really tough plant to exist. And so we'll come back to it a bit later. I'll touch on it for biocontrol, but it's effectively a genetically modified invasive species. So touch on invasive plants for Botswana. You're not immune to them. South Africa, we have a vast variety and amount of invasive species. We have tens of thousands of introductions, but we list about 400 invasive species. And we list them once we regard them as having a significant economic or environmental impact. And that allows us to prioritize them for management. And so we also have to sort of restrict those lists so it is feasible that we can try and conduct some form of management on those species. I'm no expert from Botswana, but I was able to find a few things, so I'm happy to be corrected by anyone working within the field of invasion biology or invasive plants in Botswana. But it looks like you have some good legislation regarding primarily aquatic weeds. Obviously, water systems are incredibly important for Botswana, but also it seems like the Department of Environmental Affairs are working on invasive species, and I direct you to the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. I found a bit on invasive species there, and there are a few handbooks on species that shouldn't be in Botswana and are becoming invasive. And the impacts vary, and there's 4 main impacts that you could reduce it down into, but that would really be dumbing it down. And these are pretty general impacts of invasive species. Some will have greater effects in one area to another, but they in general cause a loss of biodiversity. One that I've worked on in Botswana is they choke waterways, especially floating invasive weeds. They reduce water availability. I saw some great examples in the listing of invasive species. People talking about mesquite, prosopis in your dry areas. It's moving out of South Africa and really getting into Botswana and Namibia, where this reduced water availability is really, really a massive impact. And then the direct economic impacts on agriculture and the economic impacts of having to manage these invasive species. So I want to touch quickly on common characteristics of invasive plants. Again, this is so great. They came up in the quiz. Again, this is not one. Each invasive plant has all these characteristics. It might just have one. And we'll touch on the environments they get introduced on. And so it's a combination of plant characteristics, but also the environments where they're entering, which may facilitate the spread and establishment of invasive species. So firstly, they grow fast. They outgrow smaller native plants. A lot of it is direct competition. They are winning the competition against native plants is what will make an invasive species establish and able to spread. So as I mentioned, grown in a range of conditions like lantana, can really survive in harsh conditions where other species can't. Prolific seeds. In South Africa, we really struggle with wattles. I saw black wattle come up a number of times. That's a species I work on, and we monitor the seed rain of those wattles, and they can produce tens of thousands of seeds per square meter every single year. And those seeds can then live in the environment for over 50 years. And so if that sort of accumulation of seeds is occurring, which is more than any native species, you can see why they're going to become established and become dominant in the system. Reproduces asexually. A lot of invasive species produce sexually, asexually, allow for vegetative growth. Again, it's no guarantee that you're going to become an invasive species if you can reproduce asexually, but it definitely helps. Aquatic weeds, any small bits breaking off and spreading into the environment that can also grow, really helps in their reproduction and spread and becoming dominant. And most invasive species follow a very similar trend. This is just an example of Panthea rantiaca, but it really could apply to just about every invasive species. Just not all of them get monitored as well as this one does. And the little squares are data points on areas in hectares that were actually measured. So the introduction in the late 1800s, by 1930s, a few more sites are being recorded. By 1960s, a lot of sites are being recorded, and by 1990s, it sort of stopped spreading and the number of hectares is leveled out. And that's usually as a result of environmental conditions. It's filled the entire niche where it can grow with a competitive edge. And that's what we'd call, and we'll come back to this graph a bit later on, but that's a standard invasion curve that's shared by most invasive species entering a novel environment. I'm going to touch on some of the as I mentioned, the environments prone to invasions. Some are more prone than others and more susceptible to getting invaded than others. And as I've touched on a few times, and South Africa is particularly prone to invasion by a lot of things, particularly trees. And that's because of the environments we're offering, and trees can find a really good niche to establish. Just like that example, I did my PhD on floating aquatics or aquatic plants in South Africa, and this is the Vaal River. That's actually should be water, and the invasive weed currently filling that entire river system is water hyacinth. And what happened in South Africa, unlike Botswana, we don't really have large, slow-moving or large, still-standing water systems. So we didn't have native plants that evolved into those systems. And so when we started damming up our rivers, we created slow-moving water bodies, but we had no plants that were really good at surviving in those water bodies. The second problem with South Africa is we haven't really looked after our water bodies, and they're incredibly nutrient rich. Our agricultural systems allow fertilizers to wash into our river systems, but also we have poor wastewater treatment processes. And so when people started slow-moving plants, aquatic plants specialists from the Amazon, mainly for the aquarium trade or garden ponds, and they ended up in these systems, there was no competition for them. So this plant, water hyacinth, comes from the Amazon, introduced into South Africa, and found a water system with no competitors and a lot of nutrients, and it was able to take over completely. And this is actually quite a common picture for South Africa, and we have 5 similar slow-moving floating aquatic plants that are specialists for slow systems, and our water bodies are highly impacted and invaded by them. Community richness, there's a nice forest in the background, really rich diversity of different trees. And when you have these native systems with a lot of plant diversity, you get low invasion into these systems. Disturbance, really good for allowing invasive species or alien species to establish and take over. And that's why lots of them are agricultural pests. So wherever we're plowing or we're disturbing next to the roadside, you'll get some invasive species that really dominate those niches and are able to establish and grow faster than what native species could reinvade. And so anyone working in agriculture or knows about invasive species, it's really common to see wherever you have disturbance, you'll see invasive species popping up in these environments. And then the last one, and the one I'm going to focus on a bit more, as this is sort of the foundation to my research, is the escape from biotic constraints. And before I click the next slide, I want to give a quick example of if a grass seed lands in your sock when you're visiting South Africa and you go back to Botswana and it lands in your garden and grows up, it didn't bring anything that was associated with it from South Africa with itself to Botswana. And effectively, it escaped everything that relies on it here in South Africa. And we call that the enemy release hypothesis. And the way I like trying to get my students to look at this in an actual visible way is to go into your garden and look at the different tree species or plant species. And if one plant is covered, every leaf has a little bite out of it, there's a rust fungus on the stem, you can notice life on it. You will know nearly immediately that's a native plant. However, if you go into your garden and you look at the plants and there's not a chew mark on the leaf, the flowers are perfect, you will nearly immediately know that's an alien plant. Plant and insects and plants and pathogens, they all evolve together and they live with each other. You get some generalists, some things that will grow on one and not the other, but in general, there's a close relationship between a plant and its insects. And so if you follow the little schematic in the native range, rich diversity of organisms living with the plant, but once it's introduced into an invaded range, it's escaped all these things. And effectively, all those organisms living on it act as a controlling factor. Making little holes in the leaf slows its photosynthetic rate. Damaging the flowers reduces the pollination. So a plant escaping all of that is in a much healthier condition than what it would have been in its native range. But most importantly, it's a much healthier condition than every other organism in that environment who is still dealing with their suite of associated herbivores. So it's at a competitive advantage. And effectively, that brings me to introduce weed biocontrol. I'm not going to get too much into it. There's a wealth of literature out there, and anyone can contact me if they want any more information on it, but it's an incredible science and really has some amazing outputs. So in real basic terms, it's a use of a host-specific natural enemy to reduce the negative impacts of invasive alien plants. And the key word there is really host-specific. So you've got to find an organism that is limited to the plant you are trying to target for biocontrol and ensure it doesn't impact any other species. I'm going to use a quick example of a weed I worked on. It's called Sagittaria platyphylla. It comes from the USA, and it's an aquatic weed that's invading a lot of systems in South Africa. And so it was introduced through the aquarium trade, and so we started a biocontrol program on it. So I went across the USA and to look at it in its native range to look for insects that were associated with it. I found about 3 different weevil species, and I brought those in. And when I bring them back into South Africa, you can't just release them into the environment because that potentially will cause more catastrophic events. And we have these amazing facilities called quarantine facilities, and effectively that's insect jail. So I bring those insects into the insect jail at Rhodes University into quarantine. And then I have to find all closely related plants to that invasive species in Southern Africa. And this brings me back to Botswana, because all the closest plant species related to Sagittaria are from the Okavango swamps. And so I had to get every permit on earth to go and spend weeks traveling up and down the Okavango swamps with various scientists from Gaborone and looking for various invasive plants that I could, not invasive, native plants that I could pick, collect, try and get them growing, and then bring them back to the insect quarantine in South Africa so I could test this insect could not survive on those plants. It had no option. If it ate and survived on those plants, I'd have to go back to America and look for more plants. I also collected some plants from Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and some from South Africa. And that process took about 12 years. I spent 12 years trying to prove that that insect that I brought from the USA could not damage any other plant in Southern Africa before I could get permission from our government to release it. Once released, and we released it last year, it has started reducing the populations of Sagittaria across South Africa. So it's been a really great success, and I'm 100% confident it won't have any negative effects, only positive effects. And that control will be permanent. So that's a really nice, we won't have to use chemicals or chemical control for that. And so going back to that curve, I spoke about the curve of invasion. And if you look at the introduced plant there, established, starts spreading, reaches the sort of the extent, the ecological extent it can survive in. And then in my example, last year I released a biocontrol agent. The agent finds this plant, there's so much of it, it's really happy, it can eat as much as it wants, it can breed as fast as it can because there's so much food for it, and it starts bringing down the population of the weed. But at some stage, there's too little weed for it to find it as easily as it was, and its population starts decreasing. And over time, we get this classic plant predator or predator-prey relationship that reduces the plant density down from where it was having a huge economic and environmental impact down to where it's hardly even noticeable in the environment. Just some examples. This is Kisumu. That is Lake Victoria. It doesn't look like a lake. And this is water hyacinth, which was introduced into the lake in about 1989, I think. No insects with it. It escaped its predators and soon covered about 20,000 hectares. Massive, massive invasion across the lake. In fact, affecting all the local communities. You see these fishing boats couldn't get out. Anyone trying to go out in a canoe couldn't get out. Just massive impacts. Scientists introduced 2 little weevils, Neocotynia brucei and Neocotynia cornei. The adults cause these little chewing marks on the leaves, but the main damage that they do is these larvae The little larvae is in the middle of that photo, and it mines the base of that water hyacinth plant, which allows water to get in, and they're like little boats on the water, and if this larvae mines a hole in the bottom, water gets in and it sinks. And within a couple of years, the entire population of water hyacinth was reduced to a more manageable amount. So you can see a huge invasion, and after introduction of the insects, we get this massive reduction. Still present along the side here, but you can now access the river, the lake, and it's utilizable. You can use it. The next example is, this is a weed that I worked on in Botswana. It's in the Okavango swamps and was causing similar issues to this in a lot of the sort of slow streams and bays where there were high in nutrients. In the bottom left is a little weevil called Pseudobagus salviniae. It was introduced, and you get this sort of massive reduction of the weed quite quickly. And this is a persisting biocontrol, successful biocontrol program that is currently at play in the Okavango swamps. Botswana doesn't have too many biocontrol programs. We have about 130 in South Africa. In Botswana, there's about a handful. We work with various entities within Botswana to develop biocontrol programs. We currently have a few ongoing at the moment, various ones on cactaceae species. As we mentioned, Prosopis, both water lettuce, Salvinia, and water hyacinth isn't on the slide, but water hyacinth in the Zambezi is very much managed with biocontrol. There are some agents that spread naturally from South Africa onto the lantana in Botswana. They haven't done particularly well yet, but I believe there's a mite that's on its way called Aceria that's been having amazing impacts in Zimbabwe and across South Africa, and really hopeful that will start having a benefit in Botswana too. And this is my last slide, so it gives you an example. This is water lettuce in Botswana, where the little floating pond on the left is water lettuce with a little weevil on, and the one on the right, the weevil isn't there yet, and that's the sort of impact you can get from biocontrol. And those ones on the left, if it was in an open system, would sink to the bottom and no longer be a problem. And I think I'll stop there because I assume I'm around half an hour. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time.
There is one that was from Humility Menyere, who asks, how do invasive species cause climate change?
I am listening. Can you hear me?
Hi, Guy.
Hi, yeah, great talk and brilliant. This is a brilliant gathering of people. I must say, I'm very impressed. Well, the link between invasives and climate change is really multidimensional. In some cases, you could argue that invasives can enhance climate change. And, through, for example, altering a fire cycle, perhaps, or some other way of changing the carbon cycle. But as you all know, in Africa, there's a huge pressure now to plant forests of sometimes invasive species in Africa. And that's another very interesting interaction between invasive species and climate change. If they're used in the solutions to climate change, they could be introduced and then escape and become invasive. And we've seen that happen, obviously, in much of southern Africa, other parts of Africa too. And then there are many, many other ways that invasives can interact with climate change. Warming can, for example, enhance the invasiveness of certain species, at the same time depress the effectiveness of endemics. So climate change invasives sort of dance in the game of global change together. And well, we've got to be alive and awake to those interactions. Thanks very much.
I have another question from Christine, the Anglophone coordinator at Chesco in Africa. If she's with us,
Hi, Grant. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really super. I learned more than I know. And I wanted to ask you to go into a little bit more what effects invasive species can have on insect biodiversity. So like pollinators, etc. I mean, I imagine that just you get densification of alien species and then you're losing ecosystem diversity, but I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, great question. It all comes down to this effect of forming monocultures. Well, one aspect of it, I mean, you get various push-pull systems with invasive species, but at a fundamental level, if you've got huge environments being dominated by a single species, you're excluding you're reducing the biodiversity, and biodiversity equals species richness, and that applies to insects. You brought up pollination. I work on a plant species called Robinia pseudoacacia, black locust, and it has these big white pendulous flowers that are incredibly fragrant. And in Europe, they celebrate it because they suggest that you can get monofloral honey, which is great. So it's honey made. It's so attractive to bees that the only honey those bees produce is from the pollen of Robinia. But so that suggests to me that every other plant that was trying to find a pollinator during that flowering period missed out on the opportunity. And so in South Africa, we looked at some native plant species, but also crop species, well, not crops, fruit species, apples, specifically, that were in flower during the same time as Robinia. And there was this huge vacuum, effectively, as everything was attracted by Robinia away from where it should be. So with limited invasions, that's okay. You can get away with it. Not all the bees will be attracted, but in massive invasions, there's a real problem for that production. Yeah, and then as I also said, yeah, it's a horrible story, isn't it? Just invasive species having these impacts on absolutely everything. But climate change is as important for these for insects specifically, and biodiversity. Even monitoring invasive species. I've been looking at some invasive species that historically were studied at the accumulation of insects. And even our native species are losing the insects associated with them, but even the natives, the alien species, are losing the sort of insects on them, which will also make them more invasive. So some have accumulated insects over time, which slows down the invasiveness. But now with climate change, they're starting to lose those accumulated insects. So some things might become, that had stopped being as invasive, might become invasive again.
I think we have one question from Little Mazembe and the students, and then later will come Professor Guy Mishley for the question or comment.
My students sent me to ask a question about the biological control that, when you control, you introduce, for example, let's take the example of the Salvinia weevil. When you introduce it, the relationship is not going to be only between that weevil and the weed. Are there situations where the interaction between the control agent and others, it makes it difficult for the control process to happen? I'm not sure if I'm clear.
I think so. Let me try and answer, and if I don't get it, then we'll try and clarify. The first thing to remember is these insects are specific, so they won't go onto any other organism. So a plant. So that Salvinia weevil will only survive on Salvinia molesta. But there are opportunities for it to still exist in the ecosystem. For example, parasitoids. So there's a parasitoid that lives on weevils, and suddenly there are a lot more weevils in the system. And so you might increase parasitoids numbers within the ecosystem by introducing a biocontrol agent. Worth considering, but it always goes back to the impacts of invasive species. And if you do nothing about Salvinia, it starts dominating your entire system. And that impact might push everything else to extinction anyway. So usually we only start looking at biocontrol where we go like, we desperately need a solution here because the weed is having such a significant impact that if we do nothing, we're going to lose the environment anyway. So then we'll introduce a biocontrol agent, but they reduce. So initially there's a lot of the biocontrol agent too. So there's a lot of weed and there's a lot of biocontrol agent. But then the weed starts getting less and less and less and less and less. the biocontrol agent doesn't stay abundant. It also gets less and less and less and less and less. And by the end, there's very little weed and very little biocontrol within that ecosystem. So it's a very small, it's no longer dominating the system. So yes, at times there might be an ecosystem effect where there's a lot of biocontrol agent and weed in the system, and then you can sort of measure an interaction. But by the end, there's so little of both of them in the environment that it must be very difficult to measure if there is an effect at all. I don't know if that answers.
Thank you. Thank you. And let me welcome Professor Guy Mishley before we move on to another, the second presentation.
Yeah, just a quick question, and I think there'll be some excellent questions. Grant, I mean, I'm just thinking about the general theory of invasions and whether or not we've thought enough about are there fundamental differences between the way that producer organisms invade ecosystems, or in other words, plants, versus consumer organisms? And, are the two theories of invasion for producers and consumer organisms the same? And do we know that? And if not, does that mean that there might be different ways to approach controlling invasives of either consumer or producer organisms?
Yeah, great question, Guy, and probably worth more of a brighter mind to answer than mine. But isn't the fundamentals the same there? My mind goes to the guys who study functional responses, and that's the sort of prey-predator relationship and how fast it can eat a prey organism, and you get the various curves. But I saw them doing the exact same experiment with the use of using plants, looking at their use of nitrogen. So it would still exist there, as in a plant still needs to get stuff. It's effectively still taking stuff out of the ground, and so that's why. And aquatic weeds, it's pulling the nutrients out of the water, and so the more nutrients, the faster it grows. And I think that would apply to consumers: is the more prey, the faster it grows, the faster it can spread and become abundant. But I don't think that applies in every sense of the word. But yeah, I haven't given it too much thought, but I'll apply my mind and see what I come up with.
Yeah, if you have any answers, I'd be interested to hear. I think it's still remains an interesting question, and maybe worth thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Grant. Probably we'll keep the conversation later. Let's have move to the human dimension with Diana.